vous voulez bien, nous allons reprendre le cours de nos échanges. Nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir pour la 3e année Robert Beckford, voilà, que je présente brièvement. Pour la 3e année, Robert Beckford vient nous faire profiter à la fois de sa longue réflexion et de son long engagement en matière de justice réparatrice. Et on a besoin de ces témoignages, de ces expériences vécues ailleurs. Robert Beckford est professeur de théologie, professeur de justice sociale. Ce sont des disciplines qui ne sont pas du tout associées en France et je me réjouis de les voir associées de cette manière-là ici. Alors je voudrais simplement dire une phrase de Robert que j'aime beaucoup, que je trouve profonde et très inspirante. C'est quelque chose qu'il met dans l'entête de la présentation de ses travaux sur Internet. Il ne faut pas aller contre le racisme, il faut aller au-delà du racisme. Et je trouve que c'est une belle et profonde phrase. Et je lui passe donc la parole.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Bonjour. I was sorry that I couldn't be with you this morning. I was unwell yesterday. I had food poisoning. I was very disappointed because I thought the French standards were higher. I could have stayed in England to get sick, but I'm better now, thank goodness. It's been a real pleasure and honor to be on this journey with you.
Bonjour à tous. Je suis désolée de ne pas avoir pu être présent ce matin. J'ai une intoxication alimentaire. Je pensais que les standards français étaient plus hauts, mais maintenant, je vais mieux. Et donc, merci de me recevoir.
This is the 3rd year that I've been privileged to participate in this event, and every year it's got better.
C'est la 3e année que j'ai l'occasion et le privilège de participer à cet événement, et tous les ans, c'est de mieux en mieux. Now?
What I said was Liverpool were robbed by Paris Saint-Germain. Did you not hear that? You didn't hear that? Oh, go ahead. Go. I think what it is, the microphone is not. Yeah, your microphone is not. Yeah.
Ah, pas du tout? Là, vous
That's it.
Ah,
Yeah, there you go.
pardon.
There you go. You go.
Ouais.
Fantastic. The work that Didier and the team have done over the last 3 years has been groundbreaking.
Le travail qui a été fait par l'équipe durant ces 3 années était incroyable.
You have set the pace for how to memorialize the ancestors.
Vous avez fait en sorte de mémorialiser les ancêtres.
And to campaign for reparatory justice.
Et de faire la campagne d'une justice réparatrice.
What I'd like to do in this talk this afternoon is explore how we measure the compensation for reparations.
Ce que j'aimerais faire cet après-midi, c'est de calculer l'ampleur de la compensation et de la réparation qui doit être faite.
The reason for doing this is because economic justice is at the heart of racial justice and reparatory justice.
La raison pour laquelle je veux faire ça, c'est que la justice économique est le cœur de la justice raciale et de la réparation, de la justice réparatrice.
In fact, I would argue you cannot have reparatory justice without proper compensation.
Je dirais même plus, on ne peut pas avoir de justice réparatrice sans une vraie compensation.
Although compensation is just one feature of a reparatory process.
Bien que la compensation n'est qu'une seule des caractéristiques de ce processus de réparation.
But an important one.
Mais un facteur très important.
What I want to do for the next 50 minutes is screen a film that I made 20 years ago.
Donc, ce que je veux faire pendant cette présentation, pendant ces 15 prochaines minutes, c'est de vous faire visionner un film que j'ai réalisé il y a 20 ans.
The film is called Empire Pays Back.
Le film donc, s'intitule L'Empire contre-attaque.
And I've used a phrase underneath that emerges out of African American culture.
Et j'ai utilisé une phrase qui vient de la culture afro-américaine.
When the sums don't add up, the African Americans say, the maths ain't mathing.
Donc les Afro-Américains disent les chiffres doivent être cohérents.
And I believe that in many cases, when we have calculated the compensation, the maths ain't mathing.
Et j'aimerais dire que dans beaucoup de cas, quand on doit calculer les réparations, les chiffres ne sont pas cohérents.
The film was made in 2005, and it uses national compensation metrics or measurements for calculating reparations compensation. Yeah, good. It's all up there. Good. The same system was used by the international advocacy group, the Brattle Group, for their report in 2023.
Donc le rapport Brattle a utilisé le même système de mesure international.
The Brattle Report is the international standard for reparations calculation.
Donc le rapport Brattle est le standard international pour le calcul de réparation.
And at the heart of it is the film that I'm just about to show you.
Et donc le cœur de cette réparation, c'est le film que je vais vous faire visionner.
I should have told you to bring some popcorn,
J'aurais dû vous dire de ramener du popcorn,
but maybe next time.
peut-être la prochaine fois.
Before we start, let me just put this film in a broader context in the UK.
Avant de vous faire visionner ce film, laissez-moi recontextualiser les choses donc en Grande-Bretagne.
Reparations and reparatory justice is not a uniform practice. There are many different perspectives and positions.
Donc, avant tout, la réparation et la justice réparatrice ne sont pas une pratique uniforme.
There are four basic schools of thought. Yeah, there are four basic schools of thought.
Il y a 4 différents courants de pensée.
First is the legacy and spiritual approaches.
Donc la première est l'héritage et l'approche spirituelle.
The core idea here is that reparations is connected to religious traditions.
Donc ici, la réparation est connectée à des traditions religieuses.
For example, as a theologian, reparations has a biblical understanding.
Donc pour moi, la réparation, c'est avant tout une compréhension biblique.
In fact, compensation systems in the Bible are higher than the compensation systems used in the Brattle Report.
Le système de compensation dans la Bible est, selon moi, plus haut, plus important que dans le rapport Brattle.
you can see why so many organizations want to close the Bible when it comes to talking about reparations.
Vous constatez donc pourquoi beaucoup veulent fermer la Bible quand il s'agit de compensation.
The second camp is the Pan-African camp.
Donc la deuxième est la campagne panafricaine.
The key idea here is that reparations must be global. You can't do repair in Britain without neglecting what's happening on the continent of Africa or other parts of the African diaspora.
L'idée ici, c'est que la réparation doit être globale, mondiale. On ne peut pas faire une réparation en Grande-Bretagne sans compter la diaspora africaine et tous les pays africains.
The third camp is a radical tradition.
Donc le troisième point, c'est la tradition radicale.
They basically want the perpetrators to show the check and go away.
Donc en gros, ils veulent que les perpétuateurs, s'en aillent.
Show the check. Show me the money.
Il faut qu'ils payent.
Because reparations is not necessarily about reconciliation.
Car la réparation n'est pas forcément synonyme de réconciliation,
But a redistribution of resources.
mais une redistribution des ressources.
Finally, there is the institutional approach.
Ensuite, on a, dernièrement, l'approche institutionnelle,
Mainly the work of universities and other civic bodies.
avec beaucoup d'approches universitaires.
This work, while diverse, is fundamentally concerned with engaging in local and national communities in which the universities have a historic responsibility.
Donc le travail institutionnel est divers et il s'engage au niveau national. Car ces universités ont une responsabilité.
It should be noted, none of these positions are static. They can move and be connected in diverse ways.
Toutes ces approches sont mobiles et sont connectées à différents niveaux.
So theoretically speaking, this is an ideal type of model.
Donc en théorie, c'est un modèle idéaliste.
Descriptive, not prescriptive.
Descriptif et pas prescriptif.
There is a final model,
Il y a un dernier modèle,
but Emmanuel Macron said I wasn't allowed to share it with you.
mais Emmanuel Macron a dit que je n'avais pas le droit de vous le partager.
Obviously, I'm just joking on that one. Those are the four basic ones. What I want to do now, then, is screen the film. We have put the film on a hard disk drive so that we can play it with the sound. So I'm going to hand over now to the technician to set the film. It lasts for 50 minutes and it has French subtitles.
Donc maintenant, je vais vous faire visionner le film. Donc on l'a mis sur un disque dur pour que vous ayez le son. Et ce sont les techniciens qui vont s'occuper du reste. Et le film durera 15 minutes.
But I did use a computer software package to translate, so there may be a few issues here and there.
Il se peut que dans la traduction, il y ait quelques coquilles.
Okay. I can play it here, and the sound will be okay. Okay, let's. I should say, I wasn't able to digitize this film before the television channel got rid of it.
Je n'ai pas pu digitaliser le film
as a consequence, I only had a VHS copy.
Donc, je n'ai qu'une copie VHS.
Which had the first 5 seconds rubbed off.
Et je n'ai que les 5 premières secondes de ce film-là. Ah non, pardon, excusez-moi, je n'ai pas les 5 premières secondes.
So consequently, the film begins 5 seconds in, so you need to watch from the very start.
Donc, vous devez regarder dès le début parce que le film commence dans les 5 secondes.
And rip them away from their homes. Okay, there is no sound.
This film has been funded by the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. MJR is a registered charity working for racial and class equality in the church and society. Central to the work of MJR is to identify and challenge the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, including its continued injustices and consequences for all communities, white and black. MJR believes that reconciling slavery is integral to creating a fair and convivial culture and vital to the integrity of Christian witness, unity, and renewal of fellowship. We are making this film because of the historical neglect of slavery as a cornerstone of British Christian history. Christian reconciliation, therefore, is essential to racial reconciliation in the churches in England. In the wake of the murder of the African-American George Floyd in 2020 and the subsequent global protests, it is evident that the church must confront racism in all its forms in the Christian community. This film is both educational and redemptive. It tells how the church became embroiled in a racist discourse and how it can atone for this past. The film provides concrete examples of restitution, reconciliation, and forgiveness. In this film, we go on a journey to understand how the church became involved in the selling and buying of black bodies. We will travel back in time to the story that justifies slavery, the curse of Ham. We will consider how by the early 1800s the church became a slave owner, and we will look at what this history means for Christian reconciliation today. It all started with the premise that the population of the earth can be traced back to the Bible, and most importantly, the children of Noah and their descendants.
The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole of earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it across their shoulders, and walked backwards, covering the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they didn't see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. Lowest of slaves he shall be to his brothers."
After the flood, the Bible tells us that Noah cursed Ham for looking at his nakedness. And the curse was, may your son, Canaan, be a slave of slaves. In other words, an eternal slave. Now that's the end of the story. There's nothing in that story about Africans. However, that story was interpreted to mean that Noah cursed all black Africans with eternal slavery. And that is the curse of Ham. So the question is, how did blackness get into the story? And the answer is through the name Ham. It was understood that Ham is related to the Semitic words that mean black or dark or even hot. And therefore, Ham was understood to refer to the black African. The idea that the biblical story of the curse of Ham referred to black Africans was the single most important proof used for the enslavement of blacks. Not only in antebellum America, primarily in antebellum America, but throughout the world, throughout Europe, you find this over and over again. I've traced this reference to the curse of Ham as support for black slavery as late as in 1966 in a popular Bible commentary. Or even go even further. Just a few years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a resolution renouncing the curse of Ham. In recent times, only in the last 30 years or so, scholars have shown that that word Ham, the Hebrew word Ham, is not, I repeat, is not related to the to blackness or darkness or even to heat. It's been shown that the name Ham has a different root from the Semitic words that do mean black and dark and hot. Well, what then does Ham mean? We don't know. Origen was the greatest Christian exegete, in other words, interpreter of Scripture. Jerome, St. Jerome, who came a couple of centuries later, in fact, said that there was no better exegete than Origen. Color symbolism of black and white is ancient, and it's universal. Yes, black means negative, white means positive, but it's an abstract notion. And Origen comes along and he took the abstract notion of blackness as evil and applied it to a black person. In his interpretation of every black in the Bible, meaning sin, he put a face to that abstract color symbolism. And this notion had an enormous impact on later Christian interpretation. Every Christian interpreter accepted Origen's interpretation, and the black meant the sinner.
Key to understanding this history is a text. It was a romance, which was thought to have come out of Eastern Europe and then circulated widely throughout Western Europe.
The Christian priest hiegt Cleophas. He clapped the Sudan of Damas after his own name. His heed that black and loathly was, all wheat become, though goddess grass, and clear withouten blame. That was the Middle English of the King of Tars. The King of Tars is a late 13th or early 14th century popular story that circulated in the medieval world. This one has a little bit to do with love and desire, but it actually has a lot more to do with religious conflict between Christianity and Islam, and the ways that that maps onto race, onto blackness and whiteness. In the King of Tars, a black Muslim sultan hears of the indescribable beauty and wisdom of a white Christian princess in the kingdom of Tars. And he decides he absolutely must have her. Her father says absolutely not. So the Sultan wages war on the kingdom of Tars, and ultimately it is decided that in order to stop all the bloodshed and destruction, she will go marry the Sultan. And in so doing, she'll have to convert to Islam. Secretly, however, she continues to practice Christianity. And this becomes all too clear when they try to bear a child together. Instead of bearing a child, she bears a shapeless, lifeless lump of flesh, an undifferentiated blob. So then she and her husband come to a negotiation. If he can get his Islamic priests to convert this baby, to bring it to life miraculously, then she will really convert. But if that doesn't work, then he has to allow her to have a Christian priest try to convert the child into a living being. Lo and behold, it's only the Christian priest who's able to do it. When he readies himself to convert to Christianity, and he comes before the priest in order to be baptized, his skin, which had been called, quote, black and loathly by the text, turns miraculously white and, quote, clear without blemish.
This popular story was more than just a curiosity. The King of Tars had a powerful influence on the culture at the time.
There are two strands of blackness functioning in the Middle Ages. That there's actual physical material blackness, right? And that there's also this metaphorical and largely spiritual and theological blackness. And that the two inform one another, but are not in fact the same thing. As we move out of the Middle Ages and get into the colonization of the New World by England and other European powers, the spiritual element, right, and the theological element falls out and becomes overtaken by the notion of that physical blackness and whiteness are the things that matter.
The modern racial vision that most people work with resulted from a perfect storm. It had several really crucial factors. The first element were Christians in the old world of what we would now call Europe. They understood themselves to be the people of God who replaced Israel as the people of God. That God had chosen Israel, then because of Israel's quote-unquote rejection of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, God rejected them in this way of thinking. And when God rejected Israel, God turned to those who had accepted Jesus Christ, thus the church. And the church became the people of God. Now, why this is so important is because with that idea of replacing Israel, they saw themselves at the very center of God's activity in the world. So when we come to what many historians have called the age of discovery, which we always have to be careful with that statement, because the indigenous and native peoples around the world, they don't see themselves as ever having been discovered. But let's just use that language. When they came to the new worlds of what we would call the Americas, Pacific Islands, China, the sub-Saharan parts of Africa, one, they were coming there because out of the providence of God, the plan of God, God wanted them there. And because God brought them there, something else was going to result. God had brought them there to offer to indigenous peoples, native peoples, the truth of Christianity. But now that truth of Christianity was not just a set of ideas. God was also giving them responsibility for the land and for the animals and for the environment, so that they were going to mature the people and mature the environment at the same time. Element number 3, they were in a powerful position to name who these people were. So the naming of them has to do with the way they described who they were and described themselves in relationship to who they were. And in that scale of existence, whiteness stands at one end as the kind of highest end of human maturity, productivity, and transformation. People being aligned not only with what God wants, but with who they should actually be as fully developed human beings. And at the other end stands blackness, or the African, at the very opposite of that level of maturity. And all people can be plotted somewhere along the line. So some peoples were closer to the Europeans, some people were closer to the Africans. But now let's add that 4th element, that is the claiming. The claiming had to do with taking command and taking control of the land, of the animals, of the natural resources, and the people, and bringing them to productive use. Now, why is this so important? Because it's out of these 4 elements that the idea of whiteness comes to be. And whiteness is not just an idea about skin color. Whiteness is a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. And whiteness happens because one has the power to order a world by that way of seeing and that way of being.
And through this lens, the explorer Christian nation would master the new world.
When English Protestants started to plant colonies in the Americas, and they became engaged in the Atlantic slave trade, they actually used Christianity as a way to justify who they enslaved. And so English Protestants, they generally believed that it was okay to enslave so-called heathens, but you could not enslave other Christians. But they also sort of associated their Protestant identity and their Protestant faith with the status of free people. And so when missionaries arrived in the colonies, trying to convert enslaved Africans to the Church of England, to other forms of Protestantism, slave owners were terrified about this, and they pushed back against the missionaries and against enslaved and free Black people who wanted to become Christian, because they worried about a lot of different things. First, that an enslaved person who was baptized in a Protestant church would demand their own freedom. Second, because Protestantism especially was associated with reading the Bible, with literacy skills, and missionaries indeed, especially early on, tried to teach enslaved and free people how to read the Bible. And this sort of leads into the third fear, which was they thought that Christian slaves would rebel. And so they were constantly on the watch for slave rebellion, and they would actually blame both Black Christians and white European missionaries for slave rebellions. What missionaries ended up doing, though, was trying to argue that Christianity and slavery were completely compatible. Slave owners should not fear if an enslaved person wants to become Christian. They made this argument that I refer to as Christian slavery. It means that Christianity is not going to incite enslaved people to rebel. It's actually going to make them more obedient and pliant and peaceful. That is what missionaries tried to argue to enslavers. The Quakers were actually radical in the 17th century for many reasons, but not because they were anti-slavery, but rather because George Fox, who was the founder of Quakerism, he was one of the first English Protestants to really try to reconcile slavery with his Christian faith. And so in the 1670s, George Fox traveled to Barbados, where he met with friends who were slave owners on the island. And he was really horrified by what he saw. It was his first time seeing a slave society firsthand, and he actually immediately got sick. He was sick for a month, and then when he was well enough to speak, he gave a sermon to friends on the islands about the fact that they should do more to include enslaved people in their worship and in their Quaker communities. And when George Fox arrived back in London, he published a version of this speech, and he criticized the Anglicans on Barbados for failing to do anything to try to convert enslaved people to Christianity. And Anglican missionaries, they agreed with him. So the Anglican missionary Morgan Godwin, who traveled to Barbados and also to Virginia, he also published a pamphlet about his travels in which he starts with George Fox's attack on the Anglicans.
Godwin comes out of the 17th century tumults in religion and politics that had existed in England. His father was a royalist clergyman. He was the grandson and great-grandson of Anglican bishops. And he becomes a missionary, first to Virginia and ultimately to Barbados.
Okay, now I'm holding. Okay, raise it a little bit. Okay, and I'm cutting.
Most Anglican clergymen who became missionaries never returned home to England, but Morgan Godwin did. And that moving out of a society that was dominated by plantation slavery when he moved from Barbados to England, I think gave him the space to write down some of the things that he witnessed while acting as a clergyman in Barbados. And he writes a document called The Negro and Indians Advocate that is a scathing indictment of what he saw in Barbados. Many people who wrote about slavery in the late 17th and 18th centuries in Europe did not explain the graphic and brutal realities of the way the institution functioned in the colonies. But Godwin did. The slavery that he described was physically brutal. It was destructive, and he was highly, highly critical of it. His fury at what he had witnessed, his anger at Barbados society really comes through in his work. But Godwin also believed that slavery was reformable, that it could be Christianized and thereby improved and continued. Godwin is a furious reformer, but he's not an abolitionist.
The other part of what they did is they tried to kind of create a new justification for slavery. And that was the creation of race and specifically whiteness. And this was not just missionaries doing this. This sort of emerged throughout the colonies in different ways. But what we see over the course of the 17th and early 18th century, if you read the law books, if you look at various documents, is that in the 17th century, English slave owners generally refer to themselves as Christians, and they use that word Christian to distinguish themselves from enslaved people and other people who had non-free status. And by the late 17th century, they have started to introduce a new word into their law books, and that is the word white. So you can literally see in the laws of Barbados, the same laws passed over and over, referring to Christians, 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 and then there's a switchover in about the 1690s where they replace the word Christian with the word white. Whiteness and the idea that there are white people, that itself has a history. And you can trace the idea that there are a group of people called whites that have a legal status back to the 17th century and back to places like Barbados, where it was used as a new way to justify the enslavement of Africans and their descendants.
The slave trade was multilingual and multi-denominational. The Dutch and Portuguese controlled the trade in earlier periods, but British ships carried more than 2.5 million people from Africa into slavery in the Americas in the 18th century. This was more than any other nation in that period. And between 1701 and 1800, British ships carried more than 220,000 enslaved people to the island of Barbados, where the Church of England would become the established religion.
The 18th century Church of England came out of the religious turmoil that existed in Britain in the 17th century. The Church of England in the 18th century responded to that period of turmoil by really trying to create a more hierarchical and state-aligned church. So there's a really tight relationship in the 18th century between the Church of England on the one hand and the British government and monarchy on the other. One important expression of the power and confidence of the Church of England was the founding of different voluntary organizations that were designed to push the Church of England forward in different ways.
O God of compassion, who didst open the eyes of thy servant Thomas Bray to see the needs of the Church in the New World, and its lead into found societies to meet those needs. Make the Church in this land diligent at all times to propagate the gospel among those who have not received it, and to promote the spread of Christian knowledge through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
In 1710, wealthy slave owner Christopher Codrington died and left his Barbados slave plantation to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Lands. This was the 18th century Church of England's key missionary arm.
The SPG was an interesting kind of hybrid organization. On the one hand, it was a voluntary organization. It got its energy from people who wanted to join it and did so voluntarily. On the other hand, it was also chartered by the Crown, and that charter vested control of the organization largely in the hands of the bench of Anglican bishops. And these were people who wielded both religious power and political power because of the way the church and state cooperated in the 18th century. One of the things that the SPG did was to use its political power and connections to seek to reform laws to make the Church of England stronger in the colonies and to allow it to undertake its missionary work in ways that it saw as both religiously and politically desirable. They take an active and institutional role in promoting these kinds of laws, laws that make it explicit that there is not a connection between being baptized and becoming legally free.
And when the Church of England inherited the Codrington estate, it embraced its new role as a slave owner.
The SPG and the clergymen associated with it can, I think, best be understood as pro-slavery reformers. They saw slavery as a natural part of the societies that they were a part of. They envisioned slavery as continuing indefinitely into the future. They wanted it reformed. They wanted it made more Christian. They wanted slave owners to treat the people they claimed to own more like members of their family. But they did not envision ending slavery or advocate for it. For most of the people who support the SPG, it's clear in their interpretation of the Bible that forms of human bondage, which they equate with 18th century chattel slavery, are sanctioned by both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. And for them, that means that anti-slavery movements are, in their understanding, anti-biblical.
John Newton is remembered as the cruel slave master who became a Christian, denounced slavery, and penned the famous hymn Amazing Grace. In fact, Newton became the master of a slave ship after finding the faith. He set his hymn to an African lament he overheard on a ship. It took Newton a further 34 years before he renounced slavery and devoted the rest of his life to the service of God as an Anglican priest in London. The enslaved, on the other hand, became restless with the relentless theft, destruction, and killing of Africans.
Enslaved people resisted slavery, and their efforts also furthered abolition. But to the people who were part of the SPG and part of the Anglican missionary movement of the 18th century, those efforts by enslaved people to assert their own freedom and humanity posed a threat to the hierarchical societies that they wanted to promote in the colonies. So they took slave rebellions as evidence of the dangers of abolitionist sentiment.
And they were right to be afraid. Despite efforts by the missionaries to promote a kinder form of slavery, death and suicide amongst the enslaved was high, as was the number of runaways from the Codrington plantation. So much so that the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Lands took to branding their slaves with the word society. But across the Caribbean and British America, the enslaved began to fight back.
There are cases where some Barbadian enslaved persons escaped the island altogether and went to other islands. Some ran from the plantations and went into the Bridgetown area and passed themselves off as free blacks. But then, apart from that kind of resistance, which we may call nonviolent, you also have actual rebellion. And so you have a rebellion in the 1670s in Barbados. And in 1816, we have the so-called Buster Rebellion, which is a major rebellion. And the persons who believe that each rebellion, each act of resistance put pressure on the slave system and made it clear to the abolitionists in England and elsewhere that unless slavery is abolished, the enslaved people would shortly take matters into their own hands.
Slavery formally stopped on the Condrington estate in 1834, not because the Church of England saw that it was at odds with Christianity, but because of the law. The Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833 was made possible because the British government agreed to compensate the slave owners a sum of £20 million, then around 40% of the UK's GDP. It was a huge sum, which took over 200 years to repay. But the brutal system of ownership, established over hundreds of years, would not disappear overnight.
Once emancipation came in 1834, the act was passed in 1833, but it came into effect in 1834. That act included a provision that all of the formerly enslaved persons, particularly those who worked on the fields in the plantation, that these were now to become apprentices. And that apprenticeship period was to last 4 years in the case of the non-field slaves and 68 years for the field slaves. The law said you were free, but it still specified that you had to work for your former enslaver for 2/3 of the week. The other 1/3 of the week, you could work for yourself. And some people did work for themselves and accumulated enough money to purchase their freedom. Now that's a bit of a paradox, because the law said you were free, but yet you could purchase your freedom outright. During that period, laws were passed to restrict the formerly enslaved to plantation labor. There's a law called the Masters and Servants Act, which specified that if you were on a plantation and you left that plantation seeking other work, you could be fined or imprisoned or both, simply for wanting to leave the plantation. There's another law called the Trespass Act. And again, all these laws are designed to restrict the movement of the formerly enslaved. In fact, one visit to Barbados in 1863, after emancipation, says that to the Barbadian laborer, the option was working for low wages or starvation. So the combination of low wages, bad social conditions, including housing, high mortality rates, high infant mortality, malnutrition, combination of all of these things kept blacks largely in an inferior position, social position, until the 1930s, 1940s. And it took riots and disturbances in Barbados before we may say freedom came. So while emancipation was 1834, that's the passing of the act, it wasn't until 100 years later that formerly enslaved people and their descendants finally got access to power.
Whiteness emerged to support the interests of slavers. It gave the white Christian privileges over the enslaved African. After abolition, law and policies continued to control and limit the progress of generations of Africans. 200 years later, some believe true emancipation is an ongoing project.
And with the Queen's arrival, we have today at Westminster Abbey the monarch, Tony Blair, the head of the government, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the church. The three pillars, if you like, of the British establishment.
Tuesday, the 27th of March 2007, community activist Toyin Agbetu was invited to attend a memorial service at Westminster Abbey to commemorate the abolition of the slave trade 200 years earlier.
When I entered Westminster Abbey, and as I watched the pomp and the ceremony that took place, it became very clear that this was more than just an event. I think it was reported to be something like 2,000 African people in the Abbey. It was packed. I saw people in the audience that I knew and you know, kind of sitting there and who are my friends and who I trusted and, you know, and who I love. I saw children in there. And everybody had been given a program to follow, a program, I don't know what you call it, a service, you know. And, you know, I'm a bit nerdy, quick reader, so I'm reading, you know, all the texts about what's happening, and I'm trying to work out, okay, when am I going to get out of here? And there was this part there when I was reading it, and it just said something along the lines, this is the part where we beg God's forgiveness for slavery. And I read it, and I remember thinking, hold on, this is where we beg God's forgiveness for slavery. And I thought, that not go so. So I read it again. This is where, and everyone was following the instructions line by line, and I'm reading this thing, and something inside my head is saying, Toyin, you're not supposed to be here. You know, you're not supposed to be here, leave. But you've got to remember the event was in flow, and I was never gonna ever get on my knees and beg God's forgiveness. I had to leave before that part happened. It was imperative for me to do that. And as I got up, and I just saw everyone doing this stuff, this conducting this ritual, I just felt, no, you know, I'm gonna say something as I'm leaving.
The service at Westminster Abbey to mark the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade was disrupted today by a protester who came within yards of the Queen. Toyin Agbetu shouted at the congregation of 2,000, "You should be ashamed."
Surrounded by security, Toyin was escorted out of Westminster Abbey. He was arrested and later released.
You know, the buzzwords are systemic racism. In my generation, it was institutional racism. I would call it Afrophobia. I would call it the fact that someone on the other side of the planet who's never met me can actually fear me and assume I'm a criminal without actually having spoken with me. But the loss that I struggle with the most is the murdering of the dreams and the agency of millions of African people. So I'm talking about a young child born yesterday, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 400 years ago, having dreams of being a scientist, having dreams of being an athlete, having dreams of being a musician, and that dream being murdered, and they're having to live a life of mediocrity. Not because of anything they've done, not because they don't have the talent, but because they're living in a system which is unjust, where that freedom of spirit is being stifled.
Many churches in Britain have attempted to address racism in their ranks. For decades, the Church of England has released reports, and in 2020, the Archbishop of Canterbury admitted that the church was still deeply institutionally racist. For Elizabeth Henry, who was recruited by the church, we have to look to history and address its challenges to make real change.
There are many arguments that we should forget slavery, that we should put it in our past because it's meaningless, it happened hundreds of years ago, it ended hundreds of years ago, and we need to move on. It isn't possible to move on. And the reason it's not possible to move on is we still, to this day, experience the legacy of that slavery. I was the National Advisor on Race and Ethnicity for the Church of England, which was, as it says, a national job, and involved the whole church. And the responsibility of that job related to the internal church, so how the church works with its global diaspora community, and the external church, so the church's role in issues of race, racism in wider society. In the Church of England, it was very frustrating to continually have discussions about the lack of representation, inclusion and participation of black and brown Anglicans in the life of the church. The responses invariably were positive in that we desire, we need, we want, we are intentional in seeking this change. Sadly, the actions were not so forthcoming. I maybe naively believed that the church meant what it said, that the intentionality to eliminate racism that it claimed was real and true. But sadly, there are conditions to that intentionality like there are in so many other places. And those conditions include a lack of will to relinquish, to share, to give up some of that power that will be necessary in order for that racism to be removed and eliminated.
No matter what form of Christianity we're talking about, no matter what denomination, whether we're talking about Protestants or Catholics, the idea of black leadership, of non-white leadership in the church, instructing white Christians is still a very foreign idea. And the idea that white Christians are in the position to teach, train, and educate is still a very powerful idea. Now, of course, this has spread way beyond Christianity. It's a part of the way nation states understand themselves in relationship to other nation states. It's inside the coded language like the developed world and the developing world. And in many ways, that idea of a developing world builds from this legacy of tutelage. The maturity is here, the immaturity is there.
Another legacy is the growing trend of youth who cannot identify with Christianity.
Hello Get Real family, my name is Claire Williams and I'm the founder of Get Real. We're thinking today about this question which has gained a lot of traction in today's climate with racial injustice. It is Christianity the white man's religion? Is Christianity the white man's religion?
So I created Get Real in response to several issues that I'd kind of been seeing in the sort of black UK landscape, and that was chiefly around an exodus from Christianity from millennials and Gen Z, no longer convinced of the truth of Christianity, or also quite upset by the legacy of white supremacy in some of Christian teaching, or looking at the slave trade, for example, looking at how Christianity was used to justify a lot of those horrible practices. So how does a black Christian today make sense of that? So I would say that slavery is still an issue today in terms of its legacy. If you think about the way that the abolition of slavery is taught, it really centres the work of white evangelicals like Wilberforce or Granville Sharp. And in doing that, it erases the input and it erases the instrumental work of people like Equiano or Mary Prince. You read their slave narratives, they were black British emancipators, but we don't really hear about them. So even though slavery is finished, there are still legacies of the way that sort of white narratives are centred and at the expense of black people who've been, you know, as I said, instrumental in making change.
As a historian, Pedro Welsh seeks to set the record straight about the role of Christianity in the life of the enslaved.
In Jamaica, the biggest slave rebellion that was fought in the period of enslavement was the Christmas Rebellion, also known as the Baptist War. And that rebellion was led by slaves who had accepted Christianity. We also had, after emancipation, you had the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, led by Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. Those are the two persons. And they were Baptists, so that there was a very strong Christian element to rebellion. Our ancestors chose Christianity because for them, they found something in the message of the Christian Bible which spoke to their own condition and to the possibility of freedom.
So how can we face the past, grow from what we see, and go forward differently?
First, there has to be a recognition of this legacy. And for so many Christians, what I'm sharing now is new news. And then there has to be a retracing of Christian leadership, the way churches and the way the denominations govern themselves. There has to be a kind of retracing of how those authority structures formed in relationship to the history of race. And then there has to be a serious conversation about reparations. And reparations in two senses. Not only the ways in which people of color, especially people of African descent, were disadvantaged, but the ways it continues to disadvantage the possibilities of flourishing life.
The government of Barbados and the government of other Caribbean territories have decided to promote the notion of reparations. We need reparations as repair and restoration. So reparations is both a call to the British government to help to deal with the problems, the legacy that was imposed on our people, but it is also a call to our people to accept our African heritage, to accept that something happened to us.
In Christian academia, reconciliation would look like not only seeing the work of Black theologians on our reading lists and in our curriculums, but also seeing professors, seeing academics, tutors teaching, Black people teaching within institutions as well, and showing that there is a strong Black presence in the Bible, and also there's a strong Black presence in Christian academic work as well, Christian scholarship. To believe that Christianity is the white man's religion is to buy into the lie of white supremacy, which is that whiteness is the architecture of all types of knowledge, whether that's secular, theological, or whatever. Actually, when we look at history, and this stuff isn't properly taught, unfortunately, in our theological colleges, in our seminaries, there's also a huge legacy of Christianity alive and well amongst our African ancestors long before the slave trade, long before Christianity reached Europe.
In this film, we've learnt that the church is yet to truly face its involvement in the slave trade. For the church to take a lead on racism in society, it must first reconcile its own history. It must teach the history of Christian slavery. It should open up its archives to see where it has benefited from slavery, and where necessary, make reparation. Ultimately, there can be no Christian unity without an active dismantling of the legacies of the slave trade.
If I continue to benefit from some wrongdoing, first I have to cease to benefit from the wrongdoing, if I can.
I think in terms
and
of
second,
time,
I have to...
We just take a 2-minute break, and then
This film has been...
we can use the rest of the time that we have, maybe 15-20 minutes, for any questions that you have.
Donc on va prendre environ 2 petites minutes de pause et ensuite on aura, dans le temps qui reste, 15 à 20 minutes de questions.
we need to use?
When it's French to English.
Okay, sure, yep. Okay, so the floor is open for questions.
Donc, j'étais simplement en train de me demander, le film a été réalisé il y a 20 ans, et je voulais savoir aujourd'hui qu'est-ce qui avait changé.
It's a great question. I think there have been 3 significant changes.
Je pense que c'est une très bonne question, et il y a 3 points qui ont changé.
First, I think we've won the cultural argument that slavery was a crime against humanity.
Donc, premièrement, je pense qu'on a gagné la bataille sur le fait est que l'esclavage est considéré aujourd'hui comme un crime contre l'humanité.
If you'd made that claim 20 years ago, people thought you were crazy.
Et si jamais quelqu'un avait dit ça il y a 20 ans, les gens l'auraient sûrement pris pour un fou.
Secondly, every major institution with links to slavery is now involved in some kind of process.
Deuxièmement, toutes les grandes institutions qui ont été liées dans le passé avec l'esclavage sont aujourd'hui dans de nombreuses affaires de justice. Voilà.
Yeah. And third, some institutions and organizations have offered compensation, but not used these metrics.
Et certaines institutions ou organisations ont effectivement offert des compensations, mais ils n'ont pas utilisé les mêmes mesures.
We should also acknowledge that there has been some pushback.
On peut aussi dire qu'il y a eu des retours en arrière également.
And there is currently an intellectual battle between academics who argue that there should be no reparations and academics who say the opposite, there should be.
Et il y a également actuellement une bataille entre les universités qui disent qu'il faut des compensations et d'autres qui disent qu'il n'en faut pas.
The academics who were saying yes and the academics who were saying no.
Yep.
Yes. Who are they?
Okay. Well, if you...
Donc,
okay. Sorry.
Donc sur la question des universités qui souhaitent oui ou non offrir des compensations, je voulais savoir lesquelles étaient.
Okay. There is a Policy Institute document from 2025.
Donc il y a une charte qui date de 2025.
Which has articles in it against reparations.
Avec notamment un article stipulant le désaccord sur une réparation.
One by Lord Tony Sewell. One by Lord Tony Sewell.
Donc notamment un par Tony Sewell.
And the Oxford Professor of Ethics, Nigel Bigger.
Et également le professeur d'éthique, Nigel Bigger.
And Nigel Bigger has written a book against reparations.
Donc Nigel Bigger a écrit un livre contre justement la réparation.
And there is a really good interview on Al Jazeera TV with the Al Jazeera TV with the Muslim British journalist. His name? That's it, Mehdi Hassan. There you go. There you go. No, I've forgotten his name. Go ahead.
Donc il y a eu une interview très intéressante sur une chaîne de télévision algérienne avec un journaliste.
Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera. excusez-moi, avec un journaliste musulman, qui était très intéressante.
In terms of the pro camp, you can look at the Oxford Professor of Theology, Cambridge Professor of Theology, Michael Banner.
Avec également un professeur de théologie, Michael Banner.
He's written a book which argues Britain owes £600 billion, not 7.5 trillion.
Donc, Michael Banner a écrit un livre disant que l'Angleterre donc, devait plutôt 600 millions
Yep, 600
plutôt
billion.
que 600 millions, milliards, pardon, 600 milliards plutôt que les chiffres annoncés précédemment dans la vidéo.
Also, the professor of Black Studies, Kehinde Andrews, who argues for reparations, but is pessimistic. But that's because he supports Aston Villa.
Il y a également donc ce professeur d'histoire noire qui est plutôt pessimiste à ce sujet, mais ça c'est parce qu'il supporte Aston Villa.
There is also a document published by the Roundtree Foundation, which has 7 or 8 articles by black scholars arguing for reparations.
Il y a également des documents de Roundtree qui
Yeah, there's Roundtree Foundation has a special edition which has articles from 7 or 8 black scholars arguing for reparations.
Donc il y a également la fondation Roundtree qui compte 7 à 8 personnes académiques noires qui sont pour ces réparations. Une édition spéciale.
But generally, the debate is aligned to political commitments.
Mais en général, le débat donc va dans le sens des raisons politiques.
There is no right-wing scholar affirming reparations because it is not central to right-wing interpretation of race politics. Yeah, okay, sure. I'll say, just let me say it another way. Just say, there is no, the politics determine the interpretation.
Donc ce sont plutôt les politiques qui déterminent l'interprétation des compensations et des résultats.
Est-ce que les descendants d'esclaves anglais, vous êtes anglais, c'est ça? Est-ce qu'ils connaissent, est-ce qu'il y a une façon de retrouver leurs aïeux qui ont vécu en esclavage colonial? C'est une première question. Est-ce que c'est un sujet de préoccupation? Et une question plus simple, c'est, OK, la question des réparations, c'est pour le principe, parce qu'effectivement, il y a un crime, c'est pas normal qu'il n'y ait pas à payer ce crime, d'accord. Et la question que je voulais poser, c'est qu'est-ce qu'il faut réparer? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a à réparer? Avec cet argent-là, on répare quoi? Comment on s'y prend? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait en gros? Est-ce qu'il y a une réflexion là-dessus?
Yeah. Thank you. In regards to the first question, there are several ways in which people are tracing their African ancestry.
Concernant la première question, il y a plusieurs moyens de retrouver ses ancêtres.
Yep. One way is through DNA testing.
Donc la première, c'est par rapport au test ADN.
For example, on my mother's side, we are 60% Nigerian. We're very ashamed of that, not just joking. We are 60% Nigerian, 20% from Togo, and the rest is a mixture of other West African and Central African ethnicities.
Donc, par exemple, du côté de ma mère, nous sommes à 60% nigériens, à 20% du Togo, et le reste est un mélange d'Afrique de l'Ouest et de Centrafrique.
The other way is through archival research.
Et une autre manière, c'est à travers notamment les archives.
Much of it is now online and digitized.
Et maintenant, la plupart sont disponibles en ligne.
You'll be surprised, but one of the best archives online is owned by the Mormon Church.
Et vous pouvez peut-être être surpris, mais l'une des plus grandes archives est détenue par l'Église mormone.
Because they believe if you find predecessors, you can baptize them.
Parce que eux, ils croient que si vous arrivez à retrouver vos ancêtres, alors vous pouvez les baptiser.
Through my own archival research, I discovered that 5 generations back, I have ancestors who were also white and English and who came from the southwest, Wiltshire. Yeah. Is that...
Donc, en faisant mes propres recherches sur mes ancêtres, j'ai découvert que 5 générations en arrière, donc mes ancêtres étaient blancs et anglais et venaient du sud-ouest de Wiltshire.
All of which shows you how complex this history and identity is.
Et donc, tout ce que je peux vous montrer par rapport à l'identité est sûrement très complexe.
Regarding the second question, what would be done with the money?
Et concernant la deuxième question, qui est qu'est-ce que l'on peut faire avec cet argent?
That is something for the victims to discuss and debate and determine.
C'est une question qui revient aux victimes, une question qui doit être débattue.
Nobody asked the Jewish state how it was going to use the money.
Personne n'a demandé aux victimes juives, oui, à l'État d'Israël, pardon, ce qu'ils allaient faire avec l'argent.
And the same principle should apply here.
Et donc la même chose devait être appliquée dans ce moment.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je suis Serge Sonan, je suis de la Côte d'Ivoire. C'est vrai que j'ai appris cette conférence-là en faisant le train en marche. Mais il y a une question qui me trottine un peu à l'esprit en écoutant les explications du conférencier qui dit que selon les recherches à partir de son ADN et qui serait du côté du Nigeria et soit du Togo, etc., etc. Mais l'esclavage, disons, la déportation de ces Africains-là a eu lieu il y a des siècles en arrière. Et ces pays-là ont été créés après la conférence de Berlin entre 1884 et 1885. Mais comment est-ce qu'on arrive à déterminer avec précision qu'on est originaire du Nigeria, du Togo ou de l'Afrique centrale, je ne sais pas. Je veux quand même un peu qu'il soit plus explicite. Oui, merci.
Sure. Yeah. The DNA testing takes you to ethnic groups, not nationalities. So I only used Nigeria as an example of the location. But the DNA. So go ahead.
Les tests ADN vous indiquent uniquement une ethnicité et pas une nationalité. C'est pour ça que j'ai parlé d'une ethnie nigériane.
So you can find your specific ethnic group.
Il est donc possible de trouver une ethnie spécifique.
But my story is also complicated by sociology.
Mais la sociologie complique donc mes recherches.
I am also a chief in Ghana.
Je suis aussi un chef au Ghana.
In northern Ghana, in Tamale, they made me a chief.
Donc au nord du Ghana, dans une ville appelée Tamale, ils m'ont fait tout simplement chef.
I even have adopted Ghanaian children.
Et j'ai même apparemment adopté un enfant.
Yeah, they behave better than my Jamaican children.
Qui se comportent donc mieux que mes enfants jamaïcains.
So the Ghanaians would say, I'm not Nigerian, I am a Ghanaian.
Donc les Ghanéens diraient plutôt que je ne suis pas nigérien, mais ghanéen.
But when I go to Jamaica, they say I'm not Jamaican, I'm English.
Et lorsque je vais en Jamaïque, ils ne me disent pas que je suis jamaïcain, mais que je suis anglais.
So when we're thinking about identity, we have to take on board both the root, the origin, and also the route, the journey that shapes us.
Donc, lorsqu'on considère notre identité, il faut prendre en compte nos origines comme notre parcours.
And just to say, slavery is still with us.
Et simplement pour dire que l'esclavage est encore présent parmi nous.
Sociologists, theologians, political scientists, historians use the term the afterlife of slavery.
Donc, il existe des sociologistes, des théologistes, des politiques et des historiens qui utilisent le terme de la vie après l'esclavage.
Because they argue slavery never ended, it simply evolved into other things.
Ils disent simplement que l'esclavage n'a jamais disparu, qu'il a simplement évolué.
For example, in North America, criminologists tell us that slavery evolved into the criminal justice system.
Donc, par exemple, au nord des États-Unis, certains criminologues expliquent que maintenant, l'esclavage s'est transformé en un système judiciaire.
Mass incarceration of African Americans.
Avec notamment des incarcérations en masse d'Afro-Américains.
In the Caribbean, they say slavery evolved into wage labor, slave wage labor.
Et dans les Caraïbes, ils disent que l'esclavage a évolué en travail d'esclaves, de personnes esclavisées rémunérées.
For example, where my mother is from, her father in 1920 was paid the same daily rate as a newly freed slave in 1838. So no increase in pay for nearly a century.
Donc, par exemple, si on repart aux origines de ma mère, son père était payé donc en 1920 le même salaire que recevait un esclave fraîchement libéré en 1838. On constate donc qu'il n'y a pas eu d'augmentation de salaire en presque un siècle.
And finally, the major export from chattel slavery was anti-blackness. The major export from chattel slavery was anti-blackness. And no one would say that's not with us today.
Et donc l'héritage majeur de l'esclavage, c'est l'antiracisme. Non, le racisme, pardon.
So, as the theorist Christina Sharp says,
donc, comme l'a dit la théologienne Christina Sharp,
we live in the wake of slavery as we live in the wake of the slave ship.
Donc, comme elle l'a dit, nous vivons le réveil de l'esclavage comme nous vivons le réveil des bateaux esclaves.
Slave ship, the wake of the slave ship.
Le réveil des bateaux d'esclaves.
I think we've got time for a few more. Ending at 4:30. 4:30. We'll be finished at 4:30. Because I know I'm. Yep, 4:30. Yep. So we've got time for a few more.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Well, I'm going to express myself in English. I would like to know today in the UK how descendants of the slave systems is currently living, because your video was like showing strong fact and numbers. But yes, what is the impact today? How do people are living that in the UK?
Sure. Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Donc, je voulais savoir comment les descendants d'esclaves actuellement au Royaume-Uni vivaient tout cela, tout ce qui a été montré dans le documentaire.
It's complex. It depends upon which statistics you want to use.
Alors, c'est très compliqué et ça dépend de quelles statistiques vous voulez prendre en compte.
So, for example, over 50% of African Caribbean families live below the poverty line.
Donc, par exemple, il y a plus de 50% des familles afro-caribéennes qui vivent en dessous du seuil de pauvreté.
But alternatively, African Caribbean children from poor backgrounds are more likely to go to university than their white counterparts.
En contrepartie, donc, les enfants de ces familles-là ont un taux plus élevé d'entrée à l'université que des enfants blancs.
We could also look at the pay gap, where black workers are paid for the same jobs, in many situations, less than their white counterparts.
Et on peut également regarder comment le fait est que les gens de couleur sont payés le même salaire pour tout type de travail. Moins que leurs homologues blancs pour le même travail.
But we could also look at how West African communities compare with Caribbean communities.
Mais on peut aussi regarder et comparer les communautés d'Afrique de l'Ouest aux communautés afro-caribéennes.
West African children from poor backgrounds are more likely to go to university than their African Caribbean counterparts and white English counterparts.
Les Africains de l'Ouest sont plus prédestinés à aller à l'université par rapport à leurs collègues afro-caribéens ou même anglais blancs.
Also, you'd have to consider another important statistic, the criminal justice system.
Et il y a également une autre statistique à prendre en compte, c'est le système judiciaire.
Where African and African Caribbean men and women are overrepresented.
Où donc les personnes africaines et afro-caribéennes sont surreprésentées.
Not because they're bad people, but because the system is highly racist.
Non pas parce que ce sont des mauvaises personnes, mais c'est tout simplement parce que le système est raciste.
My son always tells me that he's never been stopped and searched by the police.
Mon fils me dit souvent qu'il n'a jamais été arrêté par la police.
Because most of them in where I live have been trained by me.
Parce que la plupart, là où je vis, ont été entraînés par moi-même.
Not everybody is as lucky.
Pas tout le monde est aussi chanceux.
So the situation is complex and in many places contradictory. And I think that's true for most African diaspora communities.
Donc la situation est complexe et souvent contradictoire. Et je pense que c'est le cas dans beaucoup de pays de la diaspora africaine.
But we still have better black footballers than you do in France.
Mais on a quand même beaucoup de footballeurs noirs, notamment en France, donc c'est une chance.
Yeah, sure.
Oui, bonjour, merci pour votre intervention qui complète, mais vous n'étiez pas là ce matin, mais je sais que vous avez été en grande souffrance ce matin, donc ça complète très bien, c'est un commentaire que je fais, parce qu'on voit la grande différence entre la manière de parler de ce domaine de l'esclavage, des héritages de l'esclavage, du racisme, la différence d'agir, d'action, d'intervention dans l'espace public par rapport à la France. Alors on va encore me dire, comme il a été dit, suggéré ce matin, que je préfère le système colonial britannique que le système colonial français. Mais ce n'est pas une question d'un meilleur ou pas système colonial. C'est des différences de systèmes coloniaux. Le système colonial français a l'art de cacher, a l'art de camoufler, a l'art de faire penser à croire aux restitutions en ce moment. Il y a un grand bazar avec les restitutions qui sont, encore une fois, quand même avec un petit écran de fumée, même un grand écran de fumée, puisqu'on ne pourra restituer qu'aux pays capables de conserver les œuvres qui seront restituées, ce qui est quand même assez... c'est pas une vraie restitution, ça. Et donc, je trouve que c'est très bien ce que vous nous apportez cet après-midi, parce que c'est... dans le système britannique, c'est la possibilité claire, comme à Morant Bay, que vous devez connaître très bien, de Jamaïque, comment il a été possible quand même de faire limoger le gouverneur. Ça, c'était impossible à imaginer dans la révolte qui est jumelle en Martinique, où même Schellcher, l'abolitionniste, a défendu le gouverneur. Et pourtant, c'était l'équivalent de John Stuart Mill, etc. Donc tout ça pour dire, ça ne veut pas dire qu'un système colonial est meilleur qu'un autre. Ça veut dire, alors on m'a demandé tout à l'heure, on m'a posé la question, pourquoi c'était différent. Je pense que le modèle assimilationniste appelle le cacher les choses, ne pas dire tout ce qu'il faut dire au nom de l'indifférenciation. Et le modèle multiculturel, il appelle ce que Paul Ricoeur, je ne voudrais pas rentrer trop dans des références un peu jargonneuses, mais du trop. On va vous dire, ok, on va restituer, on va réparer, etc. Mais souvent, c'est aussi un écran. Mais ça passe par du langage sur la place publique qui est dit clairement, mais qui va peut-être lui aussi cacher, mais d'une autre manière, en faisant du trop et de l'autre côté du pas assez. Bon, je ne sais pas si j'ai été claire. Ouais, voilà. Ok.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. I'll make a few comments. Three things. You're right. There is historical amnesia. Most people do not know what the French did in their colonies and their involvement in transatlantic chattel slavery.
Alors, premièrement, je vais faire quelques commentaires, notamment 3 choses. Vous avez raison. Il y a une amnésie historique et beaucoup de personnes ne savent pas ce que la France a fait dans les colonies et notamment dans la traite transatlantique.
Secondly, I think that Haiti is an important case study for exploring France, slavery, and repair.
Deuxièmement, je pense que le cas de Haïti est un très bon exemple pour explorer justement l'implication de la France dans l'esclavage.
Remember, Haiti had to pay millions of French crowns in order to have their freedom legitimated.
Il faut notamment se souvenir que Haïti a dû payer beaucoup d'argent pour justement obtenir son indépendance.
As a consequence, it was never able to get off the ground as the first independent black country outside of Africa.
Et ça a eu pour conséquence qu'ils n'ont jamais vraiment réussi à se développer en tant que premier pays premier pays noir en dehors de l'Afrique.
Yep. Thirdly, in Britain, we talk about multiculture, not multiculturalism.
Et donc en Grande-Bretagne, c'est pourquoi on parle de multiculture et pas de multiculturalisme.
Multiculture is how culture works. Culture is hybrid, it's profane, it always mixes. There is no pure culture.
La multiculture est hybride, elle change, elle se mélange.
Multiculturalism was a a government policy to fund particular ethnic groups individually.
Donc le multiculturalisme était simplement une politique gouvernementale pour classer les ethnicités.
But it fell apart in 2007 after there were bus bombings in London because the government then moved from multiculturalism to a assimilation politics.
Et donc, c'est à partir de 2007 qu'il y a eu beaucoup de problèmes, notamment à Londres, lorsque le gouvernement a décidé de passer d'un multiculturalisme à une culture d'assimilation.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
If you wouldn't mind talking about the lessons learned from this project as potentially more countries begin to think about modeling and accounting for the debt owed in the 20 years since the film was made, what are some new ideas you have or challenges to your previous model that would be applied today?
Yes, good question.
Donc, est-ce que vous pourriez parler des leçons qui ont été apprises depuis dans les 20 ans depuis que le film a été tourné et le fait que maintenant plus de pays se montrent responsables de l'esclavage?
Yeah. The answer is the subtitle, The Maths Ain't Mathing.
La réponse est dans les sous-titres. Donc les chiffres ne coopèrent pas.
I think we have to find nationally and internationally agreed metrics for compensation, whether that be for trafficking or enslavement.
Je pense qu'il faut qu'au niveau national et international, on trouve une matrice pour la compensation, que ce soit au niveau du trafic ou de l'esclavage.
The second thing I would say is I was naive about the power of what Olufemi Tewu called elite capture.
Et deuxièmement, j'étais très naïf en ce qui concerne le pouvoir que l'on peut qualifier, notamment qui revient à l'élite.
Elite capture describes how the perpetrator or offender organizations control the narrative, control the money, and as a consequence, control the people.
Donc cela décrit parfaitement comment les responsables contrôlent les faits, l'argent et en conséquence les gens.
So,
c'est un nouveau terme qu'on utilise, élite capture en fait. C'est l'idée qu'en fait que les personnes qui sont dans des positions de pouvoir dans les institutions peuvent s'approprier de certaines idées, de certaines démarches et présenter cela comme leur travail. Et donc il disait qu'il était un peu naïf, ne pas se rendre compte de ces risques.
And
Oui, mais pardon? Captation par les élites, en fait. Oui, elite capture. C'est nouveau, en fait. Hein. Je ne sais pas si vous trouvez un terme, c'est bien. C'est-à-dire que lorsqu'il y a un mouvement qui est entamé, qui a commencé, comme par exemple le travail qu'il a fait, certaines personnes peuvent repositionner, reprendre ces idées et travailler dessus, et ça devient quelque chose d'une plus normalisé qui rentre dans l'institution. Et donc la forme de base est changée, le mouvement qui a commencé ce travail change aussi au cours du temps. Réappropriation, voilà.
Est-ce que la question c'est, est-ce que ça le routinise ou est-ce que ça fait avancer les choses?
C'est-à-dire
ça normalise ou est-ce que
ça normalise, mais ça masque les problèmes, voilà, c'est ça.
Mais bravo, on a ça tous les jours chez nous.
Yeah. And the third, I'd say there's a third. The third I think is typical of all protest movements, in that you forget that you also have to prepare for transformation. And there's a difference between protest organizing and then organizing for transformation.
Et il y a donc un troisième point qui est typique à tout mouvement protestataire, c'est de ne pas penser aux transformations qu'il peut y avoir après.
So, for example, in Birmingham, where I live, we've only just set up an organization to help organize communities to understand and engage with the new phase of reparations.
Donc à Birmingham, la ville où je vis, on vient de mettre en place une organisation qui aide à mieux comprendre qui aide à mieux comprendre les réparations.
We've been protesting for 50 years, but not developed one organization to actually do the repair work.
On a manifesté pendant 15 ans, mais on n'a pas eu donc d'organisation pour nous aider à cette réparation jusqu'à présent.
And I'll end with this because I know we're running out of time. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. Who conducts the research is really important. In fact, let me say it another way. Who conducts the research is critical. So, at the moment, most of the large research grants from Lloyd's, National Maritime Museum, and there's one other organization, but I can't remember their name. But out of, let me shorten it, out of 10 major research posts on reparations, not one has gone to a black British person.
Il est également crucial de réfléchir à la question de qui conduit ces recherches, car sur 10 postes importants dédiés à ces recherches-là, pas un de ces postes n'est revenu à une personne noire.
Now, that's not because there aren't qualified people, and I'm not saying that they should get it just because they're black. They need to be qualified as well, but everything we know about decolonizing research tells us that we have to have people with lived experience and cultural connection engaged in this kind of research?
Je ne pense pas que on devrait simplement les engager parce que ce sont des personnes noires, mais ils doivent être aussi qualifiés. Mais je pense que toutes les recherches méritent, sur la décolonisation, méritent que ce soit raconté par des gens avec des expériences vécues et avec une connexion culturelle.
And I'll give you an example of how I think this is becoming problematic. There's a lecture next week in London by one of these researchers, and she has titled the project Lord So-and-so's workforce in the Caribbean. So she has reconfigured mass torture, mass sexual assault, mass exploitation, racial terror, racial violence into the language of capitalism.
Donc, je vais vous donner un exemple concret de pourquoi ça pourrait être problématique. Donc, semaine prochaine, il va y avoir une conférence organisée par un de ces chercheurs, donc une de ces chercheurs en l'occurrence, qui a nommé ce projet quelque chose, force ouvrière. Et donc, elle a transformé la torture de masse, les violences sexuelles, les exportations, les terreurs et violences raciales en un concept capitaliste.
And just to give you another example of this, because it's very important, no, I'll leave it there because I can give you loads of examples of how this is being played out. But what I would say is that, thankfully, there are some places who are doing this right.
Donc, heureusement qu'il y a certains endroits qui agissent correctement.
For example, the University of Bristol, where Mary Annick is running a reparative program.
Donc, notamment l'université de Bristol avec Mary Annick qui est aux commandes d'un projet de réparation.
Is probably the only place that I can see in the UK.
C'est le seul endroit en Grande-Bretagne
That is pushing back against elite capture.
Qui essaye de repousser la captation par les élites.
The historical amnesia.
L'amnésie historique.
And the avoidance of developing black researchers.
Et éviter de développer des recherches sans personnes noires.
C'est-à-dire que c'est le fait qu'on essaie d'encourager les recherches par des personnes noires. On essaie d'encourager ou d'augmenter la participation de chercheurs noirs.
So there are models of good practice out there.
Donc il y a justement certains modèles qui agissent correctement.
But unfortunately, there's not one decent football team in Bristol.
Mais malheureusement, il n'y a aucune bonne équipe de football à Bristol.
I think that's the end.
Que le combat, le séculaire combat pour la liberté entièrement gagné et que c'est tous les jours qu'il vaut la peine d'être livré. Aimez Césaire.
I guess that's a brilliant way to conclude. I think we're past our 4:30 finish. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic job. Well done. Well done. No, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good. And I hope you get work. I hope next year you find the work that you want. You can always think of going to England and doing English-French translation because we're terrible at foreign languages. Terrible. In fact, foreign language department.